She wrapped the babies in blankets, left her small apartment, and headed to a nearby market. There, next to a waste bin, she dropped the twins without a second thought. As their cries echoed in the night, Juliet looked at them in disgust, and she turned her back on them and walked away, without even bothering about their safety. Juliet was born into a highly respected and devout Christian family. Her father, Mr. Kelvin, was a well-known preacher, leading one of the largest churches in the country. Alongside his wife, Mrs. Alice, they were admired by many for their strong faith, humility, and dedication to God. They had only one child, Juliet, and they poured all their love and prayers into raising her. Despite being raised in a household rooted in religious values, Juliet was a rebellious spirit from a young age. She resented the restrictions placed on her by her parents' beliefs. Mr. Kelvin and Mrs. Alice were strict and protective, insisting that she follow their teachings, attend church regularly, and avoid sinful behavior. But Juliet wanted none of it. She yearned to experience life on her own terms, free from the church's watchful eyes. As she grew older, her rebellion took form. Juliet began sneaking out of the house, partying with friends, and indulging in a lifestyle that her parents would never approve of. She surrounded herself with people who encouraged her to live recklessly, caring little for the consequences. To fuel her lifestyle, Juliet started a pattern of manipulating men, particularly those who attended her parents' church. She would flirt, make promises, and in many cases, sleep with them in exchange for money and gifts. Her life of indulgence came with consequences. Juliet soon found herself pregnant for the first time. Panicked, she turned to one of her older friends, who advised her to get an abortion. "Just get rid of it, Juliet. You're too young to be a mother. Plus, you'll lose your freedom. It's not worth it." Without thinking twice, Juliet took the advice and had her first abortion. It was a painful experience, but afterward, she felt a sense of relief. She could continue living her reckless lifestyle without any burdens. She promised herself it would never happen again, but that promise was short-lived. Within months, she found herself in the same situation, pregnant once more. Again, she terminated the pregnancy. She continued her lifestyle aborting babies as if they were no big deal, drinking alcohol and smoking harmful drugs here and there. Her parents, devastated by her choices, disowned her after learning about her lifestyle and the shame she had brought upon their family. But to Juliet, this was freedom. She saw their decision as an opportunity to fully embrace the life she always wanted, without anyone trying to hold her back. Months passed, and Juliet found herself in yet another unwanted pregnancy. Confident that she could simply terminate it as she had done multiple times, she visited the hospital. "Doctor, you know how we do it. Let's get rid of this real quick. I don't have time for this," Juliet says to the doctor. But this time, the doctor gave her shocking news. "Juliet, you know from the previous abortions you heard, I told you that there is no chance of you aborting another pregnancy. Your body system, especially your uterus, is too weak for this, and you may lose your life in the process, so you will have to keep the pregnancy," the doctor says. "You're a failure." Juliet screamed at the doctor in frustration. "I'll find someone else who can do it." Determined to rid herself of the pregnancy, Juliet visited another hospital, but the doctors gave her the same advice. Realizing that abortion was no longer an option, she became overwhelmed with anger. She didn't want to be a mother. She didn't want these babies ruining her life. An idea struck her. She would disappear to a faraway city where no one knew her. She would carry the pregnancy to term, give birth in secret, and get rid of the babies afterward. Without hesitation, she packed her things and left for a city far from home. 9 months later, she gave birth to twin baby boys, 2 healthy, crying babies. But instead of feeling the joy of motherhood, Juliet looked at them with disgust. "These children ruined my life," she muttered angrily. "I didn't want this." Late that night, under the cover of darkness, Juliet made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She wrapped the babies in blankets, left her small apartment, and headed to a nearby market. There, next to a waste bin, she dropped the twins without a second thought. As their cries echoed in the night, Juliet looked at them in disgust, and she turned her back on them and walked away, Without even bothering about their safety, she packed her belongings and left the city that same night. She returned to her former life, pretending as if nothing had happened. At the crack of dawn, the market became a bustling place with vendors setting up their stalls, unaware of the tragedy lying next to the waste bin. A group of early risers, preparing to open their shops, heard the faint cries. At first, they ignored it, thinking it was the sound of some stray animals. But as the cries grew louder, curiosity took over. One of the market women, Mama Nkechi, walked over to the waste bin. Her curiosity piqued. God, she exclaimed, her heart skipping a beat as she laid eyes on the two tiny babies swaddled in dirty blankets. Who could do such a thing? Soon, a crowd gathered around the abandoned infants, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. The sight of two helpless newborns, left to the mercy of the elements, stirred emotions in everyone. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Who could abandon babies like this? What kind of heartless person does this? This world is truly wicked. Among the crowd stood a woman who, despite the tragedy unfolding before her eyes, felt a glimmer of hope deep within her soul. Her name was Mama Susan, a widow who had longed for children of her own, but had been unable to conceive. She had prayed endlessly for a child, and for years, her prayers had gone unanswered. But standing there, looking at the abandoned twins, something stirred inside her heart. These babies, she whispered to herself, they need love. They need someone to care for them. Without hesitation, Mama Susan pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the crying infants. Her heart ached as she gently picked them up, cradling them in her arms. They were so tiny, their faces scrunched up in hunger and fear, their cries heartbreaking. "What are you doing, Mama Susan?" one of the market women asked. "You can't possibly take care of two babies on your own." Mama Susan looked up, her eyes filled with determination. "I have no children of my own, but I have love to give. These babies don't deserve to be abandoned like this. I will take them and raise them as my own." The crowd murmured in amazement. Some of the women tried to discourage her, reminding her of the challenges of raising twins alone, but Mama Susan's mind was made up. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but in her heart, she felt that these boys were a gift she could not refuse. With the help of some of the market women, Mama Susan took the twins to a nearby clinic, where they were checked by a doctor. The boys were healthy, though they were slightly underweight. As the doctor examined them, Mama Susan thought about names for the babies. "These boys will need strong names," she mused. "Names that will carry them through life's challenges." After much thought, she decided to name them Daniel and Moses. Daniel, which meant God is my judge, and Moses, which meant drawn out of the water, symbolizing how the boys had been drawn out of a hopeless situation. Mama Susan dedicated her life to caring for the twins. She worked tirelessly, doing small jobs here and there to provide for them. She was determined to give them the best life she could, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort. The boys grew up knowing nothing but love from the woman who had rescued them. She raised them with kindness, teaching them values of hard work, humility, and gratitude. However, life in the small town was not easy for the twins. Despite the love Mama Susan showered on them, they could not escape the whispers and cruel words from others. "You were thrown away like trash," some of the children at school would say, mocking them. "You're unwanted. Nobody wanted you." Daniel and Moses would return home in tears, asking Mama Susan why people were so cruel. It broke her heart to see them suffer, but she always reassured them. "Don't let their words break your spirit," she would tell them, her voice gentle but firm. "You are not what they say you are. You are loved, and you are destined for greatness." With time, the boys grew determined to rise above the insults. Daniel dreamed of becoming a lawyer, while Moses wanted to be a doctor. Despite the challenges, they focused on their studies, determined to make something of themselves. Mama Susan supported them every step of the way, working tirelessly to ensure they could pursue their dreams. While Juliet, on the other hand, back in her hometown, life carried on. Juliet had moved on, thinking little of the children she had left behind. While Daniel and Moses were chasing their dreams, Juliet's life took a different turn. After abandoning the twins, she continued her reckless lifestyle without a second thought. She had no idea what had become of the children she had left behind, nor did she care. Her only concern was enjoying the wealth and comfort that came from being married to an old senator, Senator Chris, who was wealthy beyond measure. Juliet had married Senator Chris purely for his money. He was old enough to be her father, but that didn't matter to her. All that mattered was the luxurious lifestyle he provided. Fancy cars, a lavish mansion, expensive clothes. Juliet had it all. But despite her wealth, there was one thing missing: children. Years passed, and Juliet found herself unable to conceive. She had tried everything: doctors, fertility treatments, even traditional remedies, but nothing worked. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. She had thrown away 2 healthy children, and now she could not bear even one. Senator Chris, who had been patient at first, grew increasingly frustrated with Juliet's inability to give him an heir. Eventually, the tension became too much, and the senator divorced her, leaving her with a substantial amount of money as a settlement but no family to call her own. As Juliet watched her life crumble, she was filled with regret. The luxurious mansion she bought with her settlement money felt empty. She had no friends to turn to, no family to comfort her. The men she had once partied with were long gone, and her days of carefree living seemed like a distant memory. It wasn't long before tragedy struck again. One rainy evening, as Juliet was being driven home from a failed business meeting, her car was involved in a terrible accident. The driver was killed on the spot, and Juliet was rushed to the hospital, unconscious and barely clinging to life. When she finally woke up, the doctor gave her devastating news. The accident had severely damaged her spine, and she would never walk again. Sorry, madam, I don't think you would ever walk again. You have been paralyzed because of the damages caused on your spines and legs during the accident, the doctor said. Juliet's once glamorous life had now turned into a nightmare. Confined to a wheelchair, she was forced to hire a maid to care for her. The few people she had considered friends quickly abandoned her, and she was left alone to face the consequences of her choices. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Juliet's despair grew. She knew she had made terrible mistakes in her life, and the weight of those decisions now crushed her. She had no one to turn to, no children to care for her in her time of need. Her mind often wandered back to the twins she had abandoned all those years ago. What had become of them? Were they even alive? If they were, would they ever forgive her for what she had done? Juliet, now a shadow of her former self, realized too late the true cost of her reckless lifestyle. The consequences of her actions had come full circle, leaving her broken, alone, and filled with regret. Despite her condition, Juliet was determined to maintain her luxurious lifestyle. With the small savings she had, she tried to invest in businesses, hoping to regain her wealth. She would spend hours on the phone with various companies, discussing investment opportunities, trying to find a way to turn her fortunes around. But behind her back, her maid Mary was eavesdropping on every conversation. Mary, a cunning woman with no moral compass, saw an opportunity. She knew Juliet was desperate, vulnerable, and easy to deceive. After gathering enough information from Juliet's phone calls, Mary hatched a plan with her boyfriend, an internet fraudster. They decided to scam Juliet out of the remaining money she had. Mary's boyfriend posed as the CEO of a well-known investment company. He called Juliet, presenting a convincing pitch about a high-return investment opportunity. Desperate to rebuild her life, Juliet fell for it. She invested every last penny into the fake company, convinced that this would be her way back to the top. Weeks passed, and Juliet eagerly awaited the returns from her investment. But one morning, she woke up to find that her maid, Mary, had packed her belongings and disappeared in the middle of the night. On the living room table, she found a note. Her heart sank as she read it. Dear Madam, you've been scammed. It was me and my boyfriend who fooled you into investing in that fake company. You've lost all your money, and we've relocated to Canada. Thanks for the life-changing donation. Stupid woman. Juliet's hands trembled as she finished reading. The reality hit her hard. She had been robbed of everything. The weight of her poor decisions came crashing down on her. Juliet, once a woman of wealth and beauty, was now penniless, crippled, and alone. The pain was too much to bear. Juliet couldn't see a way out. She had lost her youth to reckless living, her wealth to a scam, and now even her ability to walk. The thought of continuing life in such misery seemed unbearable. She decided that there was only one way to escape the pain: death. In a moment of despair, Juliet wheeled herself out of the house and into the busy streets. She had planned it all. She would throw herself into the path of an oncoming car and end it all. As she rolled her wheelchair to the edge of the road, a black SUV came speeding toward her. In the split second before it reached her, she launched herself forward. The driver, startled, slammed on the brakes just in time. The car came to a screeching halt, narrowly missing her. The driver, furious, jumped out of the car and ran toward her. The driver was Daniel, one of the twins she had abandoned years ago. "Woman, are you out of your mind? Why would you jump in front of my car like that?" he yelled angrily. But when he looked closer, he saw that the woman was unconscious. He rushed her to the nearest hospital, where his twin brother was working as a doctor. As the medical team worked to revive Juliet, the driver, Daniel, told his brother Moses what had happened. "She just jumped in front of my car. I don't understand why anyone would want to do that," Daniel said, shaking his head. When Juliet finally regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital bed, her head throbbing. She blinked as the fluorescent lights above her came into focus. Slowly, she remembered what had happened and realized she was still alive. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I thought I was dead." Daniel, who was standing beside her, replied, "You're lucky I was able to stop in time. Why would you do something like that?" Juliet looked away, ashamed. "It's a long story," she murmured. But something about Daniel and Moses struck her as familiar. She couldn't quite place it, but there was an undeniable connection. Daniel and Moses felt it too. There was something about this woman that stirred an inexplicable feeling in both of them, but they didn't mention it. Instead, they introduced themselves. Daniel explained that he was a lawyer, while Moses was a doctor. As they talked, Juliet began to open up. She told them about her reckless youth, how she had abandoned her twin boys years ago, and the mistakes that had led her to this moment. Both brothers listened intently, their curiosity growing. They had been abandoned by their mother when they were just babies, and hearing Juliet's story made them wonder if there was a connection. Moses, suspicious and unable to shake the feeling, decided to conduct a DNA test without telling anyone. He needed to know the truth. Could this woman be their biological mother? A few days later, the results came back, and to his shock, the test confirmed it. Juliet was indeed their mother. Daniel and Moses were stunned. The woman who had thrown them away like garbage had reappeared in their lives. Anger welled up inside them. They had grown up without a mother, constantly bullied and rejected, all because of her selfish choices. That night, they returned home to tell Mama Susan the truth. "Mama, we found our real mother," Daniel said, his voice shaking with emotion. "It's the woman I almost ran over with my car. She abandoned us when we were babies." Mama Susan listened quietly, her heart aching for the boys. She had always known this day would come, though she had hoped it wouldn't. "Daniel, Moses," she began softly, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. But holding on to that anger will only hurt you. The best thing you can do is forgive her. She's suffering now, and she needs to know that she's forgiven." At first, both brothers resisted. How could they forgive the woman who had thrown them away like trash? But Mama Susan's words stayed with them. After days of thinking it over, they decided to confront Juliet and hear her out. The next morning, Daniel, Moses, and Mama Susan went to the hospital. Juliet was lying in her bed, her face pale and filled with sorrow. When they entered, she looked up in surprise. "We're the twins you abandoned," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. Juliet's eyes widened, and she burst into tears. She couldn't believe that the baby she had abandoned is standing right in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't know what I was doing. I was so lost back then. Please forgive me. Even if you can't accept me as your mother, please just forgive me." Daniel and Moses exchanged a look, their hearts heavy. After a long silence, Moses finally spoke. "We forgive you." Juliet cried harder, overwhelmed with guilt and relief. Mama Susan stepped forward, placing a hand on Juliet's shoulder. "You made mistakes, but you have a chance to make things right now." From that day on, Juliet, Daniel, Moses, and Mama Susan began to build a new relationship. Despite everything, they chose forgiveness over bitterness. And for the first time in years, Juliet felt a sense of peace. Weeks passed, and Juliet finally started getting better with each passing days, until she recovered fully. She continued to live with her once abandoned children, and of course Mama Susan, who had raised them, and they lived happily. Juliet's story serves as a warning to those teenagers and women out there on the kind of lifestyle they have chosen to live. Be a responsible person, and remember, don't you ever live the kind of lifestyle Juliet lived, else you'll be met with regret in the future. Thanks for watching, and make sure you subscribe to this channel for more interesting African stories.